Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is MON-SEE, and in today's video, I will be sharing with you 10 difficult books that I want to read, but it's cool if you don't. I've seen a handful of creators do this type of video in the last year. I will link a couple down below that you should definitely go check out. I really enjoyed watching them. Basically, I am going to go over 10 hard books that I want to read, but remove any pressure from you as the viewer that you should want to read these or that you need to read these. The idea here is to dispel the notion that you need to read challenging books in order to be considered a serious reader. Life is hard enough as it is. You know what I mean? You should read what you want to read. And to that you might say, well, MON-SEE, why do you want to read these books? It's a personal preference. I generally like to push myself. I do believe that in order to grow, you need to step out of your comfort zone from time to time, and reading is an area in my life where I'm willing to do that. That being said, I do really enjoy reading popcorn thrillers and fluffy romances. If you've been on my channel for any amount of time, you know this about me, and reading those books doesn't make me any less of a reader. This list is going to be very subjective. We're all on our own reading journeys, so you might think that all of these books are easy to read. I have my own reasons for why I think these books will be challenging for me, and I will tell you those reasons, and then I'm going to explain why I want to read these books anyway. The last thing that I want to say before I get into it is that I considered several books for this list, ones that I knew would be tough for me, but ultimately I decided that I don't want to read them, at least at this stage of my life. I just want you to know that I am genuinely interested in reading all of these books. I didn't make this list for the sake of making a list, and you know, hopefully you will see some of these books featured in future videos of mine. Now we may begin. I'm gonna start with a book that I've attempted to read twice now, and that is The Overstory by Richard Powers. This won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2019. It is a work of environmental activism. It's about trees. There are a couple of reasons for why I found this book to be challenging. For one, it is pretty dense and it includes a lot of technical details about trees. It's very well researched, but almost to the point where it sometimes reads like nonfiction. You're also following 9 different perspectives, and keeping track of each of those storylines requires a high level of focus. I never intentionally discontinued reading it. I was enjoying myself both times. It was more like I lost the energy or the drive to push through. So I would end up forgetting about it and then moving on to books that were easier to read or books that I was more in the mood for. I have heard spectacular things about this book, but also my friend finished it last year and she told me that every time she picked it up, she was filled with a sense of dread. So that didn't necessarily endear me to the idea of picking it up again myself. And now I'm a little hesitant, a little skeptical, but just curious enough to try one more time. The second book that I have is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is one of the shorter books on my list. Considered a modern classic, this is the post-apocalyptic story about a father and son on their journey through a desolate American landscape in search of safety. This is supposed to be a very tragic story, a very bleak one, which in and of itself will make it tough to read. But I've also heard that Cormac McCarthy is not the biggest fan of punctuation, and I'm not sure how I'll handle that. I can see it being a little inconvenient. What has drawn me to this book now more than ever is that when I read reviews of it or descriptions of it, it kind of reminds me of I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, which was my favorite fiction book of 2024. The similarities that I can see without having read this book are some of the themes, the lack of chapter breaks, the scarcity of plot, and the ambiguous endings. Most of those elements don't typically work for me, but I, who have never known men, completely took me by surprise, so I feel like The Road has the potential to do the same. We'll just have to see. Next, I have The Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. This is the only true nonfiction book that I included on my list. There are others that I could have added, but I thought, let's just keep it at one. Generally, nonfiction is more challenging for me than fiction is, for the simple reason that it's meant to inform, not entertain. So it can be on the drier side. I can't read it as quickly, and it does require more brain power on my end. The additional difficulty with this one is the subject matter. So this book is about the Holodomor, which was a massive man-made famine committed by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, I believe, and it took the lives of millions of Ukrainians. I first learned about the Holodomor when I read a historical fiction book called The Last Green Valley by Mark T. Sullivan many years ago. And in that book, he only briefly touches on it, but I remember being so taken aback that I had never heard about it before, and I always knew that I wanted to learn more. I have put it off for this long because I know that it will not be easy for me to read about. I love making these videos where I talk about what I want to read. They always put books back on my radar, and I'm really glad to be reminded of this one. Then I have The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I recently bought this book because it is on my 2025 want to read list, and I am determined to get to it this year. My translation is Robin Buss, if you're curious. If you don't know, this is about a man who is unjustly imprisoned and then embarks on this obsessive quest for revenge. The most daunting aspect of this book, as you can probably imagine, is the length. I mean, this is a really chunky book. I'm not really concerned with the writing or the accessibility of this book. I've heard that it's actually pretty readable, but due to the scope of the book and the length of the book, I believe we're following a large cast of characters, and trying to remember their names and their roles could prove challenging for me. And I'm sure too that there will be some slower moving parts that will require patience. Physically too, it's a hefty book, so carrying it around and holding it while I'm reading it, and the fact that it doesn't really stay open, difficult. Even though this is the longest book on my list, I think that it will actually be the easiest for me to get through. And like I said, I can almost guarantee you that I will be reading this in the near future. Moving on to one of the shorter books on my list, I have Beloved by Toni Morrison. So I have read one other book by Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, and you know, that book left a big pit in my stomach when I finished it. There's one scene in particular that was so painful to read about. If you've read this book, you know what scene I'm talking about. And to be totally transparent, I had a hard time with it. I didn't fully understand the book or connect with it, but I am not Morrison's target audience. She has explicitly stated that she writes her books for Black readers, and I think it's important for me to point that out when sharing my experience of her writing. Even though The Bluest Eye wasn't a favorite of mine, I still gave it 3 stars because I could recognize Toni Morrison's brilliance, her intelligence, her gift with words, and objectively the themes that she discusses in her books are really important. I've always wanted to read something else by her, and Beloved is viewed as her magnum opus, so seems like the one to go with. Similar to The Bluest Eye, I think that this one will tackle some really heavy themes, and that will make it difficult to read. Morrison's prose is very poetic and full of symbolism, so it does require some thoughtful analysis as you move through it. It's not something that you can just rush through. I know some people say that her works are more impactful upon a reread, which is intimidating to me, the idea of having to read a book twice to get the full value out of it. But I think that it could be well worth my time, and there's only one way for me to figure that out. Next, I have Native Son by Richard Wright. I bought this book at a library sale last year. I'll link that video down below if you're interested. This book is considered a classic. It was published in 1940. It is set in Chicago in the 1930s, and it follows a Black man who is rightfully accused of both murder and rape. This is supposed to be dark and deeply unsettling, but also very thought-provoking. I believe that there are some pretty graphic scenes in here, so it won't be easy to read in that regard. As I was flipping through it, I noticed that it was split up into really big chunks. So book 1 is almost 100 pages, book 2 is almost 200 pages, and book 3 is around 150, but there are no smaller chapters within those major parts. And like I mentioned earlier, that tends to scare me, but I think that this book could be really rewarding, and I'm excited to get to it whenever the time is right. Moving on to a book I've talked about before on my channel, and that is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This is a science fiction book that is structured in a very unconventional way. So this is comprised of 6 distinct novellas that are told in chronological order. You only get the first half before jumping in to the next one, all the way until you reach the 6th story, which is told in its entirety. And then in descending order, you get the second half of the first 5 stories. It's a bit of a nesting doll situation. Stylistically, I think that this will be a challenge. I've heard that the first section of the book can be quite tedious, and it's where most people give up, but I'm also told that it's supposed to improve with time. I'm just so intrigued by the concept, and I think that whenever I do get to it, I will just take it very slowly. Now for a more contemporary novel that is a modern take on a classic, and that is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. The most apparently difficult aspect of this book is the heartbreaking subject matter. This is about a boy who is born to his single teenage mother in Appalachia, and it follows his experiences with addiction and extreme poverty and the foster care system. Definitely not a light read. A while back, I tried reading the Poisonwood Bible by the same author, and I was honestly so bored to tears that I quit halfway through, and that is so rare for me to not complete a book, but I could not do it with that one. I never thought that I would read anything else by this author, but one of my closest friends told me that this book was their favorite of 2024, so I have to give it a try. And I have a feeling that I might end up loving it. For my 9th book, I have The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Of all the books on here, this is the only one with like a strong philosophical bend to it. We are following 4 characters as they navigate love and existential dilemmas in the 60s and 70s in Prague. From what I understand, the author sort of interrupts the narrative to insert his own philosophical musings and thoughts and insights. I think that this is the type of book that demands a lot of contemplation on the ideas that it presents. And that's not typically my thing. I would very much have to be in the right headspace to read this. But my partner insists that I will like it. So I guess now I want to read it. Okay, here's the deal. I was really struggling to find a 10th book to put on this list. I kept staring at my shelves and coming up empty. And again, there are so many difficult books that I could have put on here, but I wanted to be honest in putting books on here that I actually wanted to read. And then I saw it, and you might think that this book is a bit of a cop-out, but it's my truth. And that book is Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. So as you can see, this is a textbook, and I certainly don't expect anyone who watches my booktube channel to want to read this themselves. If you don't know, I'm a PT by trade, and a goal of mine is to become a strength coach. But in order to do that, I have to read this book. This book is written purely to educate, and I am so out of the habit of studying, it's not even funny, so I just keep putting it off. And I'm scared because this is undoubtedly something that I will have to work very hard at, and I'm just not ready, but I know that it will be good for my professional development. So one day I will read this book. And there you have it. Those are the 10 hard books that I want to read, but you don't have to. My question for you all is, what is the most challenging book that you have ever read? And why did you choose to read it? And of course, if you have any thoughts on the books that I talked about in this video, I would love to hear them. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're doing well, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.